Recently, I saw a viral post about crows leaving gifts for people, and it reminded me of something that happened when I was a kid. No one believed me then, but after seeing that viral story, maybe someone will now. When I was young, my friend Madison taught me all about crows. She used to leave peanuts and table scraps on her windowsill for them each morning. And when we met up to walk to the bus stop, the birds would sometimes follow her, cawing. She had names for all of them, but her favorite was the one she called Agatha. A small, hunched bird, like a scrap of shadow, with tattered tail feathers. Every morning, Agatha and the others would caw outside Madison's window until she set out food. And sometimes, when she got back from school, she'd find they'd left her things in return. Soda can tabs, pebbles, bits of foil, acorns. It's treasure to them, she told me. They love shiny things. See how this blue button sparkles? Or the time they left a bottle cap. I laughed and said it was garbage and was going to toss it out. But Madison told me, never ignore the gifts of crows. She took the bottle cap and all the other things and wrapped wire around each object to make a sort of charm bracelet, which she wore everywhere. Other kids teased her, but I always thought it was sweet. How she had such a bond with the birds. Then, one day, she disappeared. People looked everywhere. She'd walked down the lane to the bus stop alone and never arrived at school. I was sick that week with the flu. Police canvassed the neighborhood. I still remember how the police came by and asked my parents questions. Asked about the neighbors, and my parents briefly called me out so they could talk with me about the route Madison and I took to the bus stop. That was when I learned she was missing. I don't remember much about their questions, just that I sat there, bundled up in a blanket and occasionally coughing, stunned, and feeling like it must all be some terrible joke. And any moment now, Madison would be at my window knocking and asking me to play. The police advised my parents not to allow me to walk alone to the bus stop anymore. I heard a caw and glanced at the window. A crow was perched in a tree outside. Will they find her? I asked my mom, even though I knew she had no answers. No one did. The days passed, and there was no trace of Madison. And on Monday, my mom drove me to school. It seemed I would no longer be taking the bus. I convinced my mom to get some almonds, and I snuck over the small fence and up to Madison's window, and put the almonds on the sill, because I figured she'd want me to feed the crows while she was gone. I still kept hoping for her, though with each day, that hope died a little more. I felt so incredibly sad. For the crows. For Madison. About a week after her disappearance, I found a penny and an acorn there on the sill, and I tucked them into my pocket. A ragged, black bird perched on the fence, watching me. Its beak opened, and it cawed again. I'm sorry she isn't here to feed you. I'll try to feed you when I can." The bird's head cocked, one shiny black eye regarding me, and then it suddenly flew away. The next morning, there were no new gifts, but the crow with ragged tail feathers was there. The bird got incredibly close, seeming to try to look me right in the eye. I heard Madison's voice in my head, all those crow facts she used to spout. They're so much smarter than people realize. They can remember human faces, and they gossip if there's a bad human, and they all warn each other. And suddenly, a shiver ran down my spine. An idea needling its way into my brain. And I asked the crow, "Do you know what happened to Madison?" The crow's head turned. "Madison," I repeated. Crows could learn words. They were good mimics. I'd never heard any of Madison's crows talk, but they watched her all the time, heard me and others call her name. "Madison," I said again. The bird suddenly flew away from me, only to perch on the branches of a tree and caw. My heart pounded. The crow was leading me someplace. It was a cold, damp November day. The clouds hung low and heavy in the sky. Mom would worry if I was gone too long, but I didn't care. I hurried over the wet leaves and into the woods. Nothing mattered except finding Madison. Whether she was alive or... I didn't want to think about it. But it had been a week by that point. The crow with ragged tail feathers flew off every time I neared its perch, drawing me gradually deeper into the dark woods. Tree branches blotted out the sun, and I noticed more birds, perched like black leaves on skeletal fingers. I stopped when the crow I was following landed on the roof of a house. It was a beaten-down old house surrounded by junk, tires, the wasted remnants of what might have once been a vegetable garden. The posts holding up the front roof on the porch were splintering. The stairs to the front door bowed, and the paint on the door peeling. A pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway that wove through the trees toward the paved street somewhere beyond. I knew this house. Or I should say, I knew of it. It belonged to a man named Crandall. But Madison and I called him the Staring Man, because apparently Madison had caught him staring at her once or twice when she walked past his property. It was because of her remarks about this that my parents and hers made us walk to the bus stop together. But we didn't really know much about him, other than that he was a recluse and looked like he was in his 30s. As far as anyone knew, he was law-abiding and had no criminal record. I didn't like him. But police must have already questioned him and found nothing, because I saw smoke drifting from his chimney. The bird eyed me. Its compatriots, perched in the trees around us, also looked down at me. I felt certain they had led me here. But there was nothing I could do on my own. So I rushed back home and burst through the front door and announced to my parents I knew who'd taken Madison. They contacted the police, but when I told the cops about the crows leading me to Crandall's house, they burst out laughing at me. "Kid, they probably just wanted you to feed them," said the cop, who seemed to be in charge. He assured me Crandall's property had been thoroughly searched. My parents apologized for wasting their time, and after I retreated to my room, I heard them all speaking in hushed voices about how kids work through this stuff in their own ways. There was only one thing left to do. I had to go and find Madison myself. The next day was a Saturday, and my parents usually slept in on weekends, meaning I'd have at least a few hours before they'd come searching for me. I got up early and slipped my shoes and coat on and went out. The faint red and pink of dawn spread through the sky as the sun rose behind the trees. As usual, I'd brought some food for the crows. I'd even tried to make a necklace of their gifts for me, though I wasn't as artistic as Madison. I saw several crows in her yard, waiting for me. I told them good morning and scattered peanuts for them, and said Madison's name several times, loudly. And then I crossed the yard and went into the woods, taking the route the crows had shown me before. Crandall's house was a good hike away, and it took some time before I at last arrived in the right area. As soon as I saw the dilapidated beige siding, I slowed, suddenly very aware of how loud my crunching steps were through the fallen leaves. A few crows watched me. I didn't even know if these were Madison's crows or different ones. The woods were full of them this time of year. I didn't see the ragged tail feathers of the only one I could recognize, the one Madison called Agatha. But even if they were different crows, it still made me feel better to have them around, and I touched the necklace for good luck. Carefully, keeping one eye on the door to the house in case the staring man should step out, I began to search. I looked up. Disheveled tail feathers, as hunched as ever. Agatha watched me from a branch, cawed, and took off. My heart raced. I followed the bird. We ventured deeper into the woods around the house, and finally, it perched on an old fallen log. The soil nearby had been disturbed. I could see even with the leaves all over, and the crow was pecking at something. A faint spark of light. A soda tab, I realized. A soda tab with a bit of wire looped through it. The blood pounded in my ears so hard it was like a roar. A rushing waterfall cascading through my veins. I could hear nothing but the sledgehammer of my heartbeat, ringing through my ears like a gong, as I reached forward, a shaking hand, and pulled from the leaves Madison's charm bracelet. Then I squatted and began to dig through the soil with the crow perched just above me on the dead tree, watching me. Sudden cawing behind me, all around me, a series of short, sharp caws. The crow on the log, Agatha, opened her beak to cack at me and fluttered away.
Hey!
Ice slammed into my veins at the sound of the deep voice. I jumped, whirling around, and a rough hand grabbed me. The staring man. His eyes were hard, glittering, bluer than the sky. They might have been pretty eyes if they hadn't been so cold in his stubbled red face.
The hell are you doing on my property?
He demanded, hoisting me by the front of my shirt.
Help!
I screamed.
Help!
His gloved hand clapped over my mouth. I fought and squirmed, but it was no good. He dragged me back the way I'd come, toward the sagging front porch of his house.
Shut the hell up!
He yelled. At first, I thought he was yelling at me. Then I realized he was yelling at the crows. We were nearly at his front door when a very loud caw sounded nearby, and the man swore as a flutter swept overhead. His grip on me loosened, then released as he stumbled back to swat at something that flew right into his face. I scrambled and ran. Behind me, the man lunged for me. But the crows were darting in and out, dive-bombing him, and he tripped. I bolted all the way home. I got lost on the way, and for a little while was wandering in the woods. Finally, I made it to my house and burst in screaming at Mom and Dad to call the police. When I told the cops about the bracelet, they asked me to show them where. But the woods all looked the same to me when I led them back to Crandall's house. Without the crows, I couldn't find it. We searched all over. No bracelet. The officers seemed to think I was making the whole thing up. They did interrogate Crandall. He admitted he'd found me on his property digging through the leaves, and said he'd grab me to try to bring me home. He also added that I was a nuisance, and that he wanted a restraining order to keep me and other kids off his land. From the trees above, the crows watched, and they watched as my parents took me home. I locked myself in my room and cried into my pillow all night, because nobody believed me, which meant Madison's disappearance would forever remain unsolved. To this day, her disappearance is a cold case. I never recovered the bracelet. Either it's still lost in the leaves, or Crandall disposed of it. I know, that's not a happy ending. Like I mentioned at the beginning, no one believed me back then about the crows. Madison was right, though, about their gifts. The birds don't bring trash. They are very judicious in the gifts they select. And I know this because a couple days after the incident with Crandall, I was sitting outside, moping at her window, and the crows brought me a gift to make me feel better. I wiped the tears from my eyes and saw, through my blurry vision, that they'd left something on the sill. At first, it looked like a pair of misshapen marbles, each mostly white, with a splotch of blue bright as the sky. Long, red tails dangled from the gloppy things. And as my teary vision cleared, I gasped. Eyes. Human eyes. I flushed them down the toilet so the birds would not be blamed. Since then, I keep every one of their gifts, each precious charm worn around my neck, like a blessing.